Today we're talking about ADU ordinances. These are affordable dwelling unit ordinances, which is how affordable units are integrated in market rate properties, both rental and for sale. Prince William County recently released a draft ADU ordinance, so we have been receiving a lot of questions. And as you will learn, each jurisdiction in Northern Virginia handles their ADU ordinances very differently. So we have some best practices to share, and I'm looking forward to that. So what we're not talking about today are accessory dwelling units. Those are also known as ADUs, which is the source of confusion. We really need a new name for those. These are smaller independent living spaces that are on the same lot as a single family home, either attached to the home itself or as a separate structure on the owner's property. We received a lot of great questions on accessory dwelling units, and we promise we will hold a future lunch and learn on that topic, but we are not going to address that today. Today, we're just talking about affordable dwelling unit ordinances, which are just one tool in our affordable housing policy toolbox. And these ordinances are not a comprehensive way to address our affordable housing needs. And basically, this is how Virginia, the ADU ordinances, how we handle inclusionary zoning programs, which can be an effective way to ensure that affordable units are integrated throughout a community, including neighborhoods of opportunity near public transportation, great schools, amenities, and quality health care. We need inclusionary zoning programs to counter our history of exclusionary zoning practices where people, based on their race, were excluded from moving into our communities. It is an important program to advance our equity goals and policies. And because the creation of affordable units through these affordable dwelling unit ordinances depends on development of market rate housing, this approach really has worked best in markets with a robust level of construction activity, which is why we have been successful in Northern Virginia. However, these policies are most effective when they can be paired with incentives for the market rate developers who we rely on to build the units. So today we're fortunate to have two experts in the field joining our Lunch and Learn discussion to help us demystify what ADU ordinances are and what they're not. Jonathan Knopf is the Executive Director for Programs at Housing Forward Virginia, where he leads housing research and education efforts across the Commonwealth. So welcome, Jonathan. Thrilled to have you. And Sarah Coyle-Etro is an affordable housing and planning consultant. She served Loudoun County residents in multiple roles during her 32-year career with Loudoun County government, culminating as acting housing director, standing up the county's newly organized Department of Housing and Community Development. So welcome, Sarah. Thrilled to have you. So first, Jonathan, we'll turn it over to you to kind of give us a perspective of ADU ordinances around the state. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Jill, for a great introduction. I think you covered a number of the points that I was going to bring up, so hopefully that means I won't go much longer than 20 minutes or so, but if I do, please speak up and just put me on mute and move on. Because there is a lot here to cover. And so my goal with this presentation is to really just give the basic 101 background on affordable dwelling unit ordinances here in Virginia, where we first started decades ago and where we are today, and maybe what to keep in mind and look forward to over the next few years, as well as the environment continues to change on this issue. So I think it's important to get some terminology in a good place first. Just like Jill said, there's the confusion between ADUs, affordable dwelling unit ordinances, and ADUs, accessory dwelling unit ordinances. In planning this lunch and learn, we tried to think if there was a better phrase for one or the other that we could use to eliminate that confusion forever, but I don't think we landed on anything that we all agreed on. And so if anybody has any good suggestions, I think we're all ears. One day we'll figure it out. But I think it's important to remember that affordable dwelling unit ordinances are often used interchangeably with inclusionary zoning. And that makes a little bit of sense. But I think it's important to start with this phrase inclusionary housing, which is also used plenty of times. And this is the way I think about it, at least. I'm not saying this is the way that everybody should, but I think this is the useful way for me to construct these terms and organize them together. So inclusionary housing really is everything under the sun that we can do at the local, state, and federal levels to promote inclusive housing policies that right the wrongs of our past and are inclusive in terms of race, ethnicity, income, and other characteristics of households. But we also have inclusionary zoning. So this is the term, again, used interchangeably with ADU ordinances. Inclusionary zoning, I would argue, refers more so to what we can do within local land use regulations to promote inclusion in residential and community development. But more often than not, when somebody says inclusionary zoning, what they are referring to are affordable dwelling unit ordinances. And this specific term is a little different state to state, but generally this is one of the more common ones. And in Virginia, this is what we use. This is what is codified in state law. And so this is what you will see in local ordinances and local zoning code that is creating an inclusionary zoning program, an incentive-based program to promote below market rate units, affordable units in new residential development. So the story really begins a half century ago, which is really crazy to think about. But the first ADU ordinance in Virginia, and I think one of the first, if not the first in the nation, was Fairfax County. And it was immediately challenged in court, as you might expect. The ordinance required that developments over a certain size include a set-aside percentage of units that would be affordable to low-income households. A developer took the county to court and said this was an unconstitutional takings, that the economic value of their land that they own was diminished, and the government was taking away the ability for them to extract the full economic value out of that land, out of that property, without any sort of offset or exchange to provide for the reduction in revenue that they would get by offering units at prices below what the market would actually bear. So after a couple of years, it finally worked its way up to the Virginia Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court agreed with the developers and said that the ordinance as written by Fairfax County originally was unconstitutional under state law. So that's the court case if anybody's interested in looking it up and reading through all of the notes for it, if you happen to be a law nerd and want to learn more. And so the county and other folks worked with state representatives and got 15.2-2304 passed in 1989, finally. So this is for the first time a piece of state law that allows local governments to create affordable dwelling unit ordinances and give specific legal authority to them to do so. And so 1 year later, Fairfax County adopts a new ADU ordinance that is fully compliant with state law under this new code. And then a couple years later, Loudoun County adopts its first ADU ordinance, again, under this 2304 statute. So what is this 15.2-2304? You will probably hear this referred to as mandatory inclusionary zoning. It's not 100% mandatory, but in practice, it pretty much is. What this statute does is grant wide power to certain localities, not everybody, certain localities, to require a share of affordable dwelling units in most residential development. And this really applies to pretty much every major residential development that may come across the county's planning department for approval, particularly because it's triggered by whether or not a special process or exemption is required, including a rezoning, a special use permit, but also site plans. And site plans are commonly used for developments over a certain number of units, that might be a pretty low threshold. So by and large, this applies to all major residential development in the counties or cities, as you'll see, that have adopted ordinances under the statute. But the key thing here that the General Assembly included, and the key reason why this is constitutional, is that the local government must provide within its ADU ordinance density bonuses and other incentives to provide commensurate offset costs for the reduction in revenue and income that the developer and property owner would be receiving or would forego because they are providing units at below market rate prices. And so this exchange, this balance, has to get created, and this is what makes it, when done properly, constitutional and can survive legal challenges. So today, this applies to, or there are 7 jurisdictions that can adopt ADU ordinances under 2304. Several of them do have programs that are operational and productive under 2304, and the 2 largest of those are Fairfax and Loudoun County. And Loudoun County specifically, you'll hear more about from Sarah a little later on. And you'll see there the dates next to some of those jurisdictions are the dates that they were added into this code by different acts of General Assembly. So in 2001, Arlington County came along and wanted to be included in here, followed by Albemarle, and then Alexandria, Fairfax, and most recently the city of Charlottesville, which currently is undertaking, completed a comprehensive plan update, is wrapping up a zoning ordinance rewrite. I think that finally did pass, and has included an affordable dwelling unit ordinance as part of that. So that's just 7 jurisdictions out of the 133 that we have across Virginia. So what about everybody else? In 1990, lawmakers said, well, we need to figure out what everybody else can do or can't do. So they adopted 15.2/2305, which I'll describe a little bit more in a minute. So this is a limited version of 2304. The first city that I could find, or the first locality that adopted a program under this new statute, was Falls Church in 2001, followed by City of Richmond in 2004. And then in 2006, Arlington County says we need to get some special treatment, and they actually now have a carve out in state law for their affordable dwelling unit ordinance, enabling legislation under 15.2/735.1, which some of you are probably much more familiar with than I am. But needless to say, Arlington County has its own program that exists separately in state code. So won't really be getting into that. But folks may have some questions on it that we'll try to answer later. And then in 2007, Virginia Beach adopts an ADU program under 2305. And several other localities across the state I know have tried to adopt programs under 2305 or thought about it, maybe adopted it, but really didn't do anything with it. And that really has been the case with Richmond and Virginia Beach. Neither of these localities has produced any meaningful number of units through their ADU programs to date. Falls Church is an exception. They have been fairly productive relative to what these other 2 localities have done. But by and large, the communities under 2304 with those quote unquote mandatory programs are producing the vast majority of affordable dwelling units under ADU ordinances across the Commonwealth. And then just to make things even more confusing, in 2020, right before the COVID pandemic, the General Assembly enacted a companion statute to 2305. They created 2305.1, which was an attempt to consolidate requests from advocates in the housing space with concerns from the home builders and developers over new ways to try to activate the abilities for localities outside of those 2304 jurisdictions to do inclusionary zoning programs. And as you'll see, this really kind of complicated things. And to date, there have been no localities that have fully adopted and started a program under 2305.1 yet. So What about 2305, just the vanilla version back from 1990? What's that all about? It grants more limited powers to all other localities, not in 2304, to adopt ADU ordinances. The key thing here is that developers are not required to participate. These are voluntary programs. Localities cannot deny applications, whether it's a special use permit or a rezoning or just a site plan approval, just because the developer elects to not opt into the voluntary program. So it can be on the books, it can be highly encouraged by the locality, it can be a really great way for a developer to get, clear, straightforward density bonuses and other incentives, but they are not required to participate. And because of this, it is not really used that often by developers, as you might expect. There's a lot of other factors that go into those decisions. But again, the key thing here is that programs created under 2305, again, for the most part, have not been very successful across Virginia. One of those reasons is that the state code here limits, sets specific numeric limits on the maximum density bonus that can be granted by the locality, as well as the share of units that can be set aside as affordable. And so those are the two caps, and that ratio that between 30% and 17% there has to be maintained in any program that's created. And that math may not always work out to what the actual development cost and market conditions might be in that community. Under 2305.1, it's basically the same thing as 2305 in terms of where it can be applied and what projects would be eligible for developers to opt into this. So it's, again, covers all localities, not in 2304, the same eligibility standards, but the program design options, as you'll see if you read the code, are greatly expanded. There's a lot more there in the statute. It's much longer, it's much more detailed, but these provisions, while expanded and much more detailed in scope, are highly prescriptive at the end of the day, particularly because the density bonus and ADU set-aside percentages, those ratios, are specifically enumerated in tables in that state code, which is very interesting and very unique. And is not something that I think is commonly done. So local governments that want to pursue 2305.1 are locked into those ratios that are specifically outlined in state code. So what does this density bonus and set aside ratio, this math, kind of look like in practice? So if you try to plot these things, I'm a visual learner, so it helps for me to try to put these things into some sort of chart or cartoon to figure them out. Looking at 2305 right here on the y-axis, on the vertical axis, is the density bonus that is allowed. So how much extra units per acre can a local government grant a developer if they decide to provide affordable units? And this is the main mechanism, the main incentive that offsets that economic cost to the developer. So we can go up to 30% here, and on the horizontal axis, the x-axis there, you see that the density bonus can go all the way up to 17%. So we're pretty limited just to that little box right there. What 2305.1 does is say, we're going to create ratios both for units that are affordable to households with low incomes, so 80% AMI or below, but also households or also units that are affordable to households that are very low income, 50% AMI or below. And you can see that the density bonuses and the share of affordable units are much greater. In theory, the allowable range is much greater for these two options, both for the low income units and very low income units that could be created under programs adopted under 2305.1. And as you might expect logically, the density bonuses that are allowed are much greater for units that are priced for very low income households, because those are going to be a higher cost that the developer has to forego. And so you want to offset that with an even greater incentive, in this case, with a higher density bonus for more units. But in addition to this core density bonus and affordability set aside thing, there are a lot of other important elements that need to go into any successful affordable dwelling unit ordinance. You have to get that ratio right, and it has to work under economic conditions and development cost and all the other things that go into what it actually takes to finance and build new housing. So you have to make sure that they are flexible or that you can amend them over time as conditions change. How do you design or how do you define which projects are eligible? Is it a matter of how many units are proposed at a given point? Is it a matter of a density threshold? Are you only permitting these in certain districts? Are you aligning it with transit-oriented development across the community? How do you decide what projects and where would be eligible to participate in an ADU program? How deep do you want your affordability to be? How does that work out with the math that you're creating with the density bonuses and the set-aside ratios? How long of an affordability term are you going to require in these units? State code does set some caps on how long these units can be affordable, and that varies by those different sections of state code. What about design standards? It's important for localities to ensure that the affordable units created by developers are just as equal in terms of their quality and finishes and sizes that the comparable market rate units are, so that there is no segregation in terms of the quality and location and finish of those units, so that there's no tiny segregated area in this development where all the affordable dwelling unit ordinances are, because in effect, really what we are trying to do here is integrate different levels of income into new residential development. What about managing these units? In some cases across the country, ADU programs are structured so that affordable units built by a private developer can be turned over to a local housing authority or an affordable housing nonprofit to manage, so that that private developer, who may not have any experience in income qualifying applicants and managing affordable units, doesn't have to worry about that, and they can focus on their market rate units. And then also, what if the certain conditions of a particular project and property just don't make it feasible to provide affordable units on site? Maybe a developer can build their affordable units at a different location that makes sense, or perhaps the developer can just do a payment in lieu of providing ADUs and contribute to a housing trust fund, which does occur in a number of localities in Virginia and is successful. So lots of different alternatives, lots of different options, lots of different considerations that have to get kept in mind as these programs are designed, developed, and implemented in order for them to be successful. It is a lot more complicated and a lot more tricky than it might be at first glance. So where are we today in terms of ADU programs across Virginia? Fairfax and Loudoun have the most successful and productive programs. They have created, anywhere from several dozen to several hundred units per year over the past few decades. Again, it's cyclical and depends on private development cycles and what the housing market may be doing. But by and large, most of the ADUs across Virginia are going to be in those two localities. Communities that have adopted programs under the voluntary state code 2305 have had much less success. I think that's for a variety of reasons, but for the biggest reason is because the local governments cannot really force the hand of the developers and say, okay, if you're going to build any significant residential development, you need to participate in this density bonus ADU program. In places like Alexandria and Arlington, these in lieu payments and contributions to housing trust funds to help the locality, fund affordable housing development and services elsewhere has been very successful. And I think you can make the argument that sometimes that is a more effective use of the developer's resources because it can perhaps better address a more specific or more immediate need that new affordable units, that are just, 5 to 10% of a new development would be able to address. And so I think that's an important alternative that communities should think in mind. Over the past decade or so, a number of jurisdictions, including the city of Richmond and others, have gone to the General Assembly and asked to be included in 2304, just like other communities have. Those have been largely unsuccessful, except for Charlottesville in 2020. And so what we've seen instead is an effort to get all of the state opted into some version of 2304. But part of that challenge has been that there's this 2305.1 on the books and has been for a few years. And lawmakers have been reticent to make significant changes or make 2304 the law of the land because they have wanted to see localities try to experiment with this new enabling statute that they passed in 2020. So I think some lawmakers will scratch their head when local governments come back to them and say, no, we really want to just get into 2304, when they'll say, well, we spent all this time trying to create 2305.1 and you're telling me it doesn't work. So there's a little bit of that dynamic going on. But I think most of you probably know and have seen recently that the latest attempt to make this mandatory inclusionary zoning available to all municipalities across the state in the most recent General Assembly session, Senate Bill 597 from Senator McPike, has not quite worked out the way maybe that the patron hoped. It did reach some initial success and made it through committees, but when crossover came and the House and the Senate tried to work out their differences, there was some pretty major changes that occurred to the bill, which originally would have made 2304, again, the law of the land, but would have added some more specific program design considerations and just kind of given localities a little bit more direction to and options to design ADU ordinances. The conference report between the House and the Senate ended up adding a requirement for a local advisory committee to be created before any new local ordinance could be adopted. But more importantly, it added a reenactment clause such that the provisions under this bill, if it were to be adopted and signed by the governor this year, would not go into effect until and unless the bill were also passed and signed by the governor in 2025. So at the earliest, summer of 2025 would be when the provisions of this bill would become law, but it's not yet been enrolled. It hasn't been sent to the governor yet. Somebody who is paying more attention to the inner machinations of the General Assembly may know exactly where it stands right now. So please put that in the chat if you know a little more context than I do. But as for now, this is stalled, and I think we will probably see this topic come up in front of the Virginia Housing Commission between now and the end of the year. So stay tuned for more information about that and meetings of the Housing Commission that may cover affordable dwelling unit ordinances at the local level in Virginia. So that is where we are today. Hopefully that is a good foundation for what Sarah will be talking about and some of the questions and conversations we may have later. So thank you, and I'll pass it back over.
Jonathan, thank you so much. That was an excellent presentation. I think you answered a lot of our questions. We know that this is a very complicated and evolving topic, helpful to see where the statewide legislation is at the moment. So we're going to transition to our next speaker, Sarah Coyle-Etro, who is a affordable housing policy consultant and expert and has been very helpful to us as we've tried to unpack this issue here in Northern Virginia.
Thank you, Jill. And Jonathan, that was a great presentation. I learned a few things and I appreciate that so much. But I especially also appreciate being able to be here this afternoon and share what I know. Now, I'm going to come at this a little bit differently because I'm really a practitioner. So I spent my career working on developing housing programs, and was very involved in the development of the Loudon Affordable Dwelling Unit Program. I know Loudon the best, so many examples I'll use throughout this will be Loudon examples, although I have learned a lot about what our other jurisdictions in Northern Virginia are doing some great work, and I will also be focusing on sharing those with you as well. So I think first and foremost, and we all know this as housing professionals, that we have a variety of need. And there's huge variability among jurisdictions in terms of what that need is per jurisdiction. Each jurisdiction needs to study their situation and come up with their game plan. But I think the bottom line is there's no one size fits all solution. So the Affordable Dwelling Unit Ordinance is tremendous. Jonathan has attested to, especially in jurisdictions that are growing, that it's an important asset to have as part of your programming. However, again, there's no one size fits all. We have a lot of territory to cover. So if we want to move to the next slide, Hannah, thank you. So just, what's the typical approach and how can we look at this? We need to add to the supply of affordable housing, which is what the ADU ordinance allows us to do. We need to protect housing that we have that is affordable. So whether it's a naturally occurring affordable housing or a LIHTC project, for example, we want to protect and preserve those units. We want to help households obtain access to housing they can afford. And we need to all work together to make it happen. So we have to have the right structure to get it done. Next slide. So in developing an ADU program, there are key considerations and a couple of things to think about. So this is a very useful solution to integrate price diversity and a variety of incomes in new neighborhoods. So it is inclusive. It does bring people to the neighborhoods that maybe would not be able to afford it were there not an affordable unit there. It adds to the supply. It will affect new development. So ADUs will be located where new development is. So for example, when you consider Loudon, Eastern Loudon County as the development area, it's an area with public water and sewer. That's where the ADUs are located. So for good or for bad, there's not as much out in the Western area where there is a need for workforce housing for farm workers and vineyard workers and so forth. But that's a different problem to solve. When you're considering developing an ordinance, and in Loudon's experience, and I think Fairfax as well, the program has focused mostly on housing for sale. So being for someone who needs affordable housing who can purchase it, so the first-time home buyer, you need to carefully consider the overall affordability to the home purchaser. So that needs to include HOA and condo fees, closing costs. So it's not just the ability to pay the mortgage and the utilities, but it's these other costs. And one thing I would point out is that Fairfax is working on their workforce development or workforce dwelling unit policy right now, and they're considering how to address HOA and condo fees within the context of that. They have a wonderful resource online that kind of walks through inclusionary zoning, but also this issue of how to address the full costs to a purchaser. In Loudon, this is an area we've struggled with. We know HOA issues and fees are quite costly to a purchaser, so it is a problem that needs to be solved. The other thing is, and key to this, is the incentive that you're providing within the ordinance has to be enough to offset the lost revenue to the builder. So typically it's density, so you're getting more market rate units, and theoretically those additional market rate units are going to pay for the lower cost unit that the ADU represents. But you have to carefully consider how you're doing that. And that's an important part, and that the incentive that you're providing will in fact entice the development of affordable dwelling units. Is it enough to cover those costs? So next slide. And some of these policy questions, Jonathan did a great job going through, so I won't spend a lot of time on them, but it's generally, what are the parameters of your program going to be? You know, it should relate to your housing needs, certainly, and be comport with your housing plan. Where will it go? At what point in the land development process will it kick in? Some programs in Northern Virginia apply at rezoning, special exception, site plan, and subdivision. Others only apply at site plan. So Arlington has a little bit of a different program. It applies at site plan. Loudoun and Fairfax apply across the board. So starting with rezoning. So also, what kind of incentives to provide, and is the balance, does it work out? One thing I would mention in terms of I think a best practice, Loudoun covers the capital facilities impacts of affordable dwelling unit. So the developer does not pay for those impacts through a proffer. The county basically picks up the cost for those capital facilities impacts. Again, another way to reduce the cost to help ensure the lower cost unit is provided. How many ADUs are you going to provide? Now, the 2305.1 is very specific about what you're going to do there. What income levels to serve and what priorities might you have? Income levels, it's important to have your measure be consistent with other housing programs so that you can use housing programs with each other. You can layer housing programs. So what I mean is using area median income, which I think across the board is what all jurisdictions use, as well as setting priorities. And we've seen different things with different jurisdictions. The city of Fairfax puts a priority on older adults, 62 and older, for their ADU program. Loudoun puts an emphasis on the workforce, so people who live and work in Loudoun County. Term of affordability, typically in the region, it's 30 years. However, there are some nuances. Fairfax, for new ADUs, has a resetting covenant, which means that they're affordable in perpetuity. Every time it's sold, the covenants reset. Loudoun has had a 15-year affordability on sale units, and honestly, it's too short. You run out of units fast under that, as well as options. And this is where jurisdictions have been very creative in the region. So what options or alternatives do you want to provide? Whether it's cash in lieu, Arlington allows offsite ADUs, for example, and then how you can pair this program up with other programs, like using public land. Fairfax has been very successful in that approach. Next slide. So we did want to show you a bit of a comparison among the Northern Virginia jurisdictions. And again, Prince William's working on their ordinance. It's out for public review right now. And some of our cities also have ADU ordinances. What I think is important is to see the number of units produced. Again, I would just say this is where it's a very useful and good generator of affordable housing, adding to the supply. It's not substantial, so you do need a combination of things, of programs. It's not a end all and be all for addressing your affordable housing issue. Although I do believe that you can leverage this program in a lot of different ways, and that's where we've certainly seen creativity among the Northern Virginia jurisdictions. Most notably, how Arlington has been able to use their cash in lieu to finance thousands of affordable units. Loudoun County made some adjustments to its zoning ordinance, which allows the substitutability of low-income housing tax credit units for ADUs, and that's been a game changer in Loudoun in terms of getting substantial development of LIHTC product. So it's very useful from that standpoint. And again, just focusing on how it's interchangeable and compatible and can be used in conjunction with other developments. I will note that Navajo has also developed a more specific or a more detailed breakdown, and we'll provide a table to you all in PDF that gives you a little bit more information. One thing important is showing what part of the state code applies to these different jurisdictions. Jonathan went over that, but it's really handy to have that in a chart. But this, you can see there's commonality. Fairfax and Loudoun's programs are very similar. And then there's some real differences. The way Arlington and Alexandria do their ADUs are very, very different. And I think that's all I wanted to say, other than Fairfax and Alexandria both have redevelopment and housing authorities, which really broadens their toolkit and gives them a lot of opportunity for being creative and innovative in their housing programs. Next slide. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and just kind of go through basic ADU program process, hoping that this will answer some of the questions you all have had about how it works. And I would say for the most part, the local government definitely is involved in this, especially in working with the builder community to set prices and agree on what the ADUs will be and the process and so forth. But typically what you'll see is that the local jurisdiction will income qualify an applicant and establish a waiting list. And then once an applicant is either a potential renter or buyer in the ADU program, they then work with the apartment complex that participates or the builder to make the deal. And other than an annual income certification, or in the case of a for sale product, it's an annual affidavit saying I still live in my ADU. There's no other additional services or participation by the local government. Now, that's very generally speaking. And so, as I have mentioned repeatedly, layering programs, some participants may be getting down payment and closing cost assistance. They may take advantage of financial counseling. There may be other parts of the jurisdiction's housing programming that they would take advantage of. But for kind of the strict ADU process itself, there's not a requirement. And so I think there's a misunderstanding sometimes that the government is really involved with these households and families. And for the most part, no, it's pretty basic. It's helping people access these new units that the development community has provided through zoning ordinance. Next slide. So just kind of stepping back to programmatic, and this just gives you a general idea of a combination of programs that a jurisdiction could have. Typically, the ADU program is, again, in Northern Virginia, it provides for incomes between 30% and 70%, so kind of that middle range of area median income. And then the continuum, is the way it's shown here. Area of greatest need moving through renter to home ownership to market rate in terms of what a jurisdiction may need to add in terms of affordable housing. And the reason I'm just pointing that out is it's nestled within and among other programs within a jurisdiction. And again, there's no one size fits all. We need the whole combination of things in order to solve the problem that we have before us. And the final slide is really just to give you some other ideas for strategies, including regulated or inclusionary. And, you know, providing zoning incentives, you can do that for affordability. You have to work within the state code, though, you know, for better or for worse, we're a Dillon Rule states. We got to follow what the General Assembly and the state code tell us. But financing programs, providing public land, and as I've said, there is a way to leverage the affordable dwelling unit program to achieve some of these things or work in conjunction. I know one question we had was whether it could work with a community land trust, and yeah, it absolutely can. The Loudoun ordinance and I think the Fairfax ordinance both allow for a certain number of units to be sold to a nonprofit. So it could go to a community land trust at the beginning of the process. Land could be donated for affordable units to a land trust. There are a variety of ways it could work. And there are resources online. The Housing Solutions, I think it's Local Housing Solutions, has a whole section on using ADUs in conjunction with a land trust. So I think that's possible. But again, what I would say, and especially as far as financing ADUs, what's critical, so an affordable housing developer needs cheap or free land and money. So how can the program be leveraged to gain that? Arlington does it by accepting cash in lieu. Loudoun has been able to use the proceeds from the sale of ADUs to capitalize its trust, which has been loaned back out to developers to build housing. So again, just showing that there's some versatility within the program itself to support many other initiatives and programs within a locality. Those things are not required, but it relies on being resourceful, creative, knowing your programs and how they can work together to address the issue.
Sarah, thank you so much. That was really helpful to kind of zone in a little bit and look at our Northern Virginia programs. And I think, as you probably all have had in the last 50 minutes, you know, it's a short amount of time to cover a very challenging topic, but we do want to, you know, leave a little bit time to answer your questions. We appreciate our local government partners who are on the call, kind of clarifying in the chat any changes or updates to their specific programs. So continue to do that, please, as we go through the Q&A. That's really helpful. And I'll just go ahead and dive right in, but we do appreciate the robust conversation and suggestions on resources, how Navajo can kind of support some of the questions you might have too around comparisons across the different programs in Northern Virginia. So we are recording this session just in case you didn't know that, and we will send this out. We will send out the presentation slides, and then Hannah put together a great, more comprehensive comparison on ADU ordinance information that we will also share, and we can make updates to that. So we just had a couple of questions back and forth, thinking through some questions on the Arlington program, and you can look in there about how the in lieu payments are calculated. I will say that Arlington and Alexandria have done a really good job, as both of our speakers mentioned, in using those cash contributions to fund the affordable housing trust funds in each of those jurisdictions, and there's some information there. There was a question about other counties having the ability to do that, or if that's just a county manager plan form of government. So I don't know if either of our speakers know if other jurisdictions can ask for cash in lieu through a specific formula.
So, and I'm a little flat-footed here because I don't have the citation from the code, but can provide it. But there is a part of the Virginia code that allows a jurisdiction to establish a housing fund. And I think to the extent that you can negotiate with new developments through the proffer process, there may be a way to do it if you're not. But I don't know, Jonathan, you're really the expert on the Virginia code. So can you do it outside of, 2304, 2305 is really what I'm getting at. And if so, how would you do it?
Yeah, it's a good question and gets into the perpetually murky and rocky territory of proffers in Virginia, which is something that I do not have a great comprehension on, and we'll leave it to others to explain that more properly. But I know that under 2305 and under 2305.1 there are explicit sections that allow locality to create a local housing fund and then have developers contribute to that as part of their contribution in exchange for the incentives that are provided. I do not think either section sets out a specific formula, and so I'm not particularly sure. I think this is one area where there's an opportunity for experimentation, but also an opportunity for greater legal clarification as well, as more localities are trying to flex their muscles and figure out what they're actually capable of. So I wish I had a better answer, but there may not be a better answer out there to find at the end of the day anyway.
Thank you. That is helpful very much. Another real comment in the chat has been around Fairfax County's, and Sarah mentioned this, their workforce dwelling unit policy for sale units, which is really a companion program, inclusionary zoning program to their ADU ordinance. And just if you have comments on those proposed changes, great opportunity for advocates to do a deeper dive into that. The link, Graham Owen put that link to the website and draft text in the chat. So really encourage you to take a look at it and provide any comments by April the 7th. Then also had a question about longer term and strategic thinking around the recent settlement with realtors against charging a buyer's agent fee, charging their clients a flat fee, which has typically been included in the seller agreement. So, and how that might impact those income qualified homeowners by having to maybe pay their own realtor fee. I don't know if either one of you have any thing to add on that, or how really those units get marketed in the local governments. I think that's a bigger comment. I don't know, Sarah, if you can share how Loudoun does it.
Yeah, so I can give you generally, and I did see that Brian's on the call. He'll really know the answer to this, but what I'm getting at is that the way the units are marketed is really on there's a web portal that a potential buyer, an ADU certificate holder who's buying, accesses the information once it's available. So it's kind of a closed system. And although Loudoun does provide provisions for realtors to be involved at certain points in the process. So for example, if the county happens to have purchased an ADU and they're selling it, they'll use realtor services. The ordinance allows for a reduced fee, so it's 1.5% for a realtor. An ADU owner who's selling can use a realtor, of course, and again, it's with a more restricted fee. So that's the way that has been mitigated in Loudoun, but it's not the typical realtor selling process that you see out in the marketplace.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I see that Josh Vaverka with NBAR is added some comments too, just that kind of echoing your comments. He doesn't see it changing that much in general, especially in this robust real estate market that we have here in Northern Virginia. And a lot of the realtors who work on these programs don't make a lot of money doing that for affordable homeowners like you suggested, and kind of really are doing it to kind of help get people into housing. So we thank the support of our our realtor community for being an important component in getting people housed in our marketplace. A note from Russell at Arlington that their ADU ordinance also applies to commercial development, which I think is unique in this area. So happy to kind of have more if anybody has any other comments on that. And he also had suggested that Arlington's ordinance resulted from its voluntary ADU policy, which was struck down in a court case, Kansas, Lincoln versus Arlington County, if any of you want to research that. And a note to shout out to Sarah, because the Out Loud ADU program is really attributed to Sarah's foresight and brilliance and hard work over many years. So I will echo that comment from Brian. Really appreciate it. And I know we are getting close to being out of time. So I really appreciate robust conversation. Obviously, a lot more information to be shared. One question, I guess, for Arlington, and maybe, I don't know, Russell, if you can ask, but studying the need in order to develop a program, and if you've published an analysis on the need in the county before taking your program. And then I think you saw that it was struck down in the court case. I will, also give kudos to Arlington for an amazing tool that they have on their website, a dashboard for their affordable housing production. It is so robust. So if you haven't had a chance to look at that, it's a best practice, I think, for a lot of our local governments, for the incredible amount of information and tracking, mapping, where we can see where these affordable units are being developed and preserved. So with that, want to thank everybody for the great conversation. We wish Prince William continued good luck as they continue to have community conversations around their draft ADU ordinance, and look forward to seeing you next month for our state legislative wrap-up session with our partners at Virginia Housing Alliance, Isabel McLean. We will send out registration information, but I believe that is scheduled to be on April the 23rd at noon. We are always open to getting your suggestions about future topics. We will cover accessory dwelling units soon, and hope to see you all again next month. And thank you so much to our great speakers for really making a very complicated subject a little bit more digestible, a little bit more understandable for all of us. Sarah and Jonathan, thank you for all the time and prep you did to share with us today. Thank you.